Welcome to Extra Takes, hosted by Northland Church Senior Pastor Dr. Joshua Laxton. Join us each week as Pastor Josh reveals the rest of the story behind his sermons. We'll discuss how those who follow Christ can live out a biblical vision for the church in our world today.
Well, hello, Northland family and friends. Welcome to another episode of Extra Takes. I am your co-host, PJ, along with the familiar face, Pastor Gus. I guess because I gave him such grief this past week, he had to join us. So he's pointing at his noggin. Well, Pastor Gus, hey, thanks so much for pinch hitting for Matt Childs. And so yeah, you decided that you wanted to do it even before I brought you into every sermon that I preached.
Oh, yes.
This weekend.
Well, you really got a good attention. What I like about doing this podcast, I like to be things that are beginning, new beginning, and this was a beginning in Genesis.
Yeah.
So I had agreed to do the extra takes, and then the sermon notes were there. But it also gave me a good way to connect with our congregation. And people say, you get along very well with that guy. I said, yes. Yeah, I'm a low risk for him to just call me up. But I love this.
No risk.
I'm just excited about the series, the Genesis series that we're doing. So thank you for that. But also another thing you brought out, I had seen it in the sermon notes, was we talk about words. You were thinking about the English words.
Right.
So what after Saturday, I was telling my wife, I said, you have that problem too. I said, oh, really? Yeah. Because of my ethnic language, there are some words that I was told by one coach before, do not pronounce them. If you pronounce them, you have to give some other synonyms with those words.
Oh, okay.
I have to be thinking. Because of my dialect, L and R are problems.
Huh.
Especially when we have one senior executive with us. Her name has those two letters, L-O-R-I. So I have to make special effort to say Lori or say Rory. And people will not get what I'm saying. And that's so our accent, the L and the R. Another word that it's a P.
Okay.
The P, I have a problem to pronounce the word. So if I pronounce the word, I have to quickly say the goal of this extra take, the aim of this extra take, the purpose of this extra take, the objective, so that I don't say the word purpose. You got it? So if I mistakenly say purpose, I have to quickly say, oh, the goal of this one. So we all live with that. Yes. So,
yeah. Wait. Well, yeah. Growing up in the South, being from Tennessee, yeah, my accent is very well. It used to be much thicker than it is now, and there were definitely some words growing up I could not pronounce. Like I could not pronounce music. I always said music. So I couldn't pronounce that. And then whenever I go anywhere in South America, or I try to say some Spanish words, or in a couple of different European countries, I cannot roll my R's. And so I don't know what it is about coming from the South. I don't know if our tongue is heavier, from other people's, because I just can't roll my R's. So I have no idea why I cannot. I've tried, and it's so funny when people try, oh, it's so easy. And they're like, and I'm like, no, it's not. It's not that easy. I can assure you it's not that easy. If it was that easy, I would be rolling my R's, and don't roll my R's. So.
Well, what I see that relates to our new series here is we're making sense out of Genesis, making sense out of life from the book of Genesis. We continue to make sense out of all of these things, how we communicate with people, what languages we speak, and all of that. So we're always making sense. But I think what I love about this message here in the beginning is that we're making sense out of life.
Yeah.
And I think Genesis is a good beginning there. And one of the questions, the people have been expecting this, but how did we land on Genesis so quickly after 2.5 years? Today, everybody start to say it's 3 years. At the meeting, Pastor Josh has been here 3 years. But you started us all the years. I will say every month we've heard something from Genesis. But how did that now become our series that we're going to go through the book of Genesis?
Well, so when I look at again a pattern for a preaching calendar, I always want to go through a book of the Bible at the beginning of the year. And so for the first half of the year, let's just go through a book of the Bible. Well, when I got to Northland, we were already in Acts, which I really love because it gives you a vision of the church. Gives you a vision of what the early church, how the church was birthed, what the church did, how they did it, and how God worked powerfully, how the Spirit of God worked powerfully through the early church. So I'm grateful that we were already in Genesis or already in Acts. And then we finished the book of Acts last year. And I knew that Genesis is a book that I refer to quite a bit. And I'm like, well, let's just make sure we go through the book of Genesis because it is the book of origin. It is the book of beginning. And I think it's really, really important to understand the beginning of the story if you want to understand the middle of the story and even where the end of the story is going. Because really, the end of the story in Revelation is the beginning of eternity. But we actually see where time and space and matter began with the eternal God, and who we know, at least in the very first verse, is Elohim. And what's interesting too throughout the scriptures and obviously throughout the Old Testament is God's going to reveal Himself in a variety of ways, and He will reveal Himself as Yahweh. And we saw that even with Moses in Exodus chapter 3. But He'll reveal Himself as Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. He will he will reveal Himself as El Shaddai, God Almighty. He will reveal Himself as our Jehovah Nisi, God is my banner. Jehovah
Nice.
Sitkanu, God my righteousness. I mean, so He's going to reveal Himself, but where you see the first revelation is Elohim, this kind
Yeah.
of generic name for God, but Creator God. And so anyways, it is interesting that we're almost 3 years into, well, almost completed 3 years, and we're finally getting around to walk through Genesis, and we'll walk through Genesis, see how far we get to by the end of May. Then we'll go into a couple of different series. We'll do a series in the fall called How to Lose Your Family in 10 Easy Ways. And so this is funny. I know people are, we're actually going to spend a little bit more time in Genesis there. And I'm going to go a little deeper into gender, marriage, family in the book of Genesis. So even in the first half of this year, as we go, kind of verse by verse through Genesis, I'm not going to say as much on the family because I'm going to tackle that in the fall. Like I could actually spend, and this is why Genesis is so 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 important. I really could spend probably a good year just going through the first three chapters of Genesis, just the first three chapters, just unearthing everything that we know because there's going to be so much in the rest of the Bible that connects back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. But nevertheless,
Yeah.
we'll do that, and then we'll in 2026 we'll pick back up in this book kind of mid-February and go through as much as we can get through until May of 2026. I mean, it's a big book, so we might
It
be
is.
in it 2, maybe 3 years, and we'll see what the Lord does.
Yeah. Well, I think they started it this weekend that we're talking about in the beginning, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But talking about it in the beginning and the context in which you started with Genesis, that we're going to ask this question: what big story are you're in. What big story are you in? I think that was very much attention getting. What big story are you in? And then you're just going to be in Genesis, 1 chapter, 3 words. So you did that and then also you stated the big story that we have to be in. And then from there, you gave us 3 questions, and then you answered 3 questions, and then you gave us these 3 takeaways. We're going to get to all of this. But one of the big story aspect that you did in this lesson was to say our little stories should be in a big stories if you want to make a sense of life. Our little stories, which we all have, should be in a big story, the larger story, the meta-narrative that you define, if you want to make a sense of life. And many times, Pastor Josh, the question I have, many people have other stories, but they don't have this big story, because we always have our little stories. And you did that very well by going back into history, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, then you came to a postmodern time. What is missing that humanity, we don't know our big story? Why don't we know our big story?
Well, that was one of the reasons why that quote that I gave, and here's the book that so if you're watching this online, you can see
Yes.
the book by Neil Postman, Technopoly. I'm reading this book again for the Faith and Technology series I'll do later on this year. But I came across that statement and I'm like, oh wow, that's such a powerful statement. And the statement really sheds a lot of light on why we've lost a bigger story that helps us make sense out of life. You see, evolution is a big story that actually leads to more confusion. Because if everything was random and it just so happened to take place and it in some sense evolved in this random chance of what we find ourselves in, okay, well then your life is random. And so you're randomly selecting whatever you want, and your life is evolving to however you want it to evolve. And again, that's going to lead to a lot of confusion. And then in post-modernity and this postmodernism, when you don't have a big story, you become the big story. Well, it's hard for people to become the big story when they're the ones having to create it as they go. And so both evolution and post-modernism, it is a randomness in trying to make sense out of life. And then when you think about life and think about all the little compartments or categories to your life, your relationships, your family, and all of that, and your work, and your thoughts and your feelings, your emotions, making sense out of pain and suffering, trying to make sense, like you're trying to make sense out of, and and you're trying to wing it. Well, that for me, that would be a very overwhelming place to be. And it's just really in the last, I would say, 150 years where human beings, particularly, again, when I say in the West, so that would be Western Europe and now the United States, Canada. Um, in the last 150 years, it's basically been human beings in that part of the world that has not had a bigger story to understand their life. Like that's what we saw with the Egyptians and the Babylonians. If you go into Asian culture, I mean, at least they have they have something of a bigger story to help make sense out of their life.
Yeah.
But it's been more modern times for the West and Americans where we just think that we're smart enough.
Well, you made it very clear that God has given us a bigger story. And so you answered that question, why do we need a big story? And the question you answered there, which you could tell us more about it, God wrote the big story through Moses. And we see you gave us the context of the when. that was another big reveal that when did Moses write this big story for Israel when they were now in the wilderness? And what was helpful about that, you clarified that we're here, we're in the wilderness. Where have we come from? And the basic questions you were answering. And also Jesus clearly referred to Moses being the one that wrote the big story. Why is this biblical story so important for us to know that this is our origin story, not those other philosophical, other stories that you talk about? Why is this a story that every Christian should go back as the backdrop of our origin? Why is this our key origin story?
Well, what comes to my mind and how I would answer that question, Gus, is I started a series when I got here called Transitions.
Yeah.
And in the very first message, and I think it was on Easter of 2022,
Yes.
I talked about cosmic transitions.
Yes.
Now, the thing about transitions is that in every transition, there is a transformation.
Sure. Yes.
And you will either be transformed more into the image of Jesus or you would be transformed more into the image of Adam. You don't have another choice, at least according to the Bible. And when you look at where Israel is, they are in a major transition. So for 430 years, they had been in Egypt, much of that time enslaved, held captive by the Egyptians. And now they are in a major transition and they're going from Egypt to the promised land. And God is going to give them answers in this big transition that will help them make sense out of life.
Yeah.
So that they could be actually conformed and shaped more into the image of Elohim, more into the image of Yahweh, because God had revealed himself to Moses as the great I am. I am who I am. I'll do what I'll do. Like there is no one like me. And that's what God is telling Moses to communicate to Israel. And so now he's giving them their written story. And so that's really, really important for us to remember is that they're in a major transition and they are in desperate need of an origin story. Because I actually do think that they've lost it. I think there are some signs, particularly in Egypt, when they're crying out. They're not crying out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They don't even use the name Abraham. They're just crying out in pain. So I think something that has been lost there. I actually think there's something that has even been lost with Moses as he spends 40 years in the when I say the desert, as he's the shepherd of Midian, because I think God had a meeting with the, meet him at this burning bush. I think Moses tried to do his savior thing without God, because he thought that he was a deliverer. We even see that with the author of Hebrews because Moses rejected being the prince of Egypt. So there's this thought that he is some kind of redeemer, deliverer, but he tried to do so as an Egyptian because that's why he killed an Egyptian.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm going to save you. Well, they rejected Moses. So I actually think that there's this identity problem that Moses has. I believe that there's this identity problem that Israel has when they're crying out to who knows who. They're just crying out. And now in the wilderness, God is giving Moses this now specific revelation to write down their origin story. Because you also have to realize in that day and age, now obviously the Egyptians wrote some things down. Obviously, even the Babylonians wrote some things down, and it depends on how you date things. Whether Hammurabi's laws or codes were written at this point. So there were some written facts and stories and laws that again different civilizations had, and so now Israel will have their own written account, and God's going to give it to Moses. Now, what is fascinating about this is that, all right, so you have the first five books of the Bible that has traditionally been assigned to Moses.
Yes.
Now, I'm not prepared to get into all of the details and the nuances, but there are some elements where scholars believe that at some point some of the first five books was edited because like Moses will say something like he will say
Yeah.
something to the effect of Dan, the tribe of Dan,
Yeah.
that still that hasn't that land hasn't been given yet, so
Yes.
and
Yes.
Moses wasn't in the land. So some people believe that at some point, the first five books got edited, but again, traditionally, conservative scholarship is going to say that Moses, he was the author of the first five books of the Bible. God's giving that revelation to Moses to actually write down so that Israel has their origin story and
Yes.
to make sense out of life and to make sense out of a life in the promised land. But I'll say this real quick too. Then what you have with the Old Testament and then the prophets is that you have now multiple authors being under the inspiration and being full of the Holy Spirit to write down other accounts about the same God. And then in the New Testament, you will have so what makes Christianity different from any other religion is that you have multiple witnesses throughout multiple times throughout history, and there is a consistency and an overarching storyline and an overarching big story that is going somewhere.
Yes.
Again, that makes Christianity different than any other religion because Islam would say only Muhammad, he's the only prophet.
Yeah.
You would have Mormonism say Joseph Smith's the only one, and so where Christianity would say we actually have multiple authors, which is why it was really hard for Israel when Jesus came because they saw him coming after Moses in the sense of like being more of an antagonist against Moses. And no, what Jesus was doing was fulfilling the law of Moses. And he was like, Moses wrote about me. Like if you would go back and
Yeah.
study it, you would see that Moses wrote, like God gave the revelation to Moses about me. And so,
Yes.
anyways, I hope that makes sense
Yeah.
for those of you
It
who are
does.
watching.
Yeah. And I think what we all are learning here that the Christian, the church, whether it's the East, the West, the South, or the North, we need to know our big story. Because what you also did in this teaching that you really debunk lots of other views of how our story came about, and you also debunk lots of other views that people say, well, this is what man came from. So that was helpful to be able to know that the church should be able to know what is written is our big story. But talk to me a little bit now that we know our big story that we should be in. You went on to talk about how do you choose the right big story to be in, which is what you're talking about in the Bible in the beginning. So now that we know this is our big story, this is our origin story that we want to be in, how do you make that choice? You can know all of this about the Bible. Jesus affirms our big story, but how do you make a choice to be in?
Yeah. Well, and let me just say this before we look at even those three reasons that I gave from those
Mhm.
three Hebrew words, but just mention briefly about theism and creationism. Somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, could
Ah,
I believe in theistic evolution and not be bad?" And I said, "You could. I mean, there are actually a lot of I would say conservative scholarship." Where they're going to hold to something like theistic evolution, and they won't
mm,
see six literal days. They will see six kind of periods or longer days per se. Now, that's not the view that I hold, but this is where I go back to even what I said at the very end is that the book of Genesis is not a science book. God's not
Yeah.
getting into the science of how he created creation, how he brought it into existence. And so I do want people to understand that listen, my heartbeat in this is actually God's heartbeat, and I believe that God's heartbeat would be is that you just need to believe He got it started, and that He's the one who brought everything into existence. And so if you want to get a little bit more, when I say nerdy, and talk more about how things evolve, because there is an element to, again, I don't want to say evolution because people would say, oh, you believe in evolution. No, but there is this element of kind of an evolving kind of earth. Um, but when it comes to creation, I'm going to say that yes, there's 6 literal days. Now, obviously, there's 7, but 6 days where God's creating. On the seventh day, He's resting. Now, I can't wait to get into that. Now, I'm actually going to get into the pattern of why I believe it's 6 days, and what's really going on there. I'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, I believe. Um, so I just want people to know is that, and that's why I put it in this big bucket of theism and creationism. Like, you just want to talk about, broadly speaking, God's the one who brought it into existence, or you want to speak more literal of creationism, where God, yes, He's speaking everything into existence, and He's putting it all in place. And so, again, I don't think that Genesis is a science book that's going to answer those questions. And so, but hey, if you want to try to figure them out, great, have fun doing it. We're not going to do it. I just don't believe that. So,
yes.
but nevertheless, it goes back into now that third big bucket of the question of how do you choose the right big story to be in. You need to be in His story, because that's what it's all about. In the beginning, because that's the other part of Bereshit is in the beginning, that like he's talking about something that actually came into existence. He's talking about the start of time, space, and matter. And so that's why I love not in a beginning, or like a lot of times, because we live in Orlando and we know all about Disney. When Disney is writing a story, once upon a time, or in Star Wars, in a galaxy far, far away. So once upon a time, that is not a definitive time. That is a time in a land far, far away. Star Wars in a galaxy, not the galaxy, but a galaxy. But what we see in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, if you really want to know where it all began, if you really want to know where this time, this space, this matter all began, here it is right here. So it's not a fantasy. It's not a story. It is the story.
Yes.
It is the story of creation. It is the story of humanity. And the story of creation, the story of humanity is actually embedded in this God who reveals Himself as Elohim. And so with that, that's where you can go, okay, so how do you choose the right big story? And so in those 3 words, it actually gives evidence, and it gives the reasons for choosing this story. And that's the first reason, is because if you choose this one, you will choose the one, you will choose the deity, you will choose the God who existed before anything existed. And that's huge. Like, there was there's no void, there was no kind of empty space, there was no primordial chaotic waters that existed. Nothing existed other than Yahweh, other than Elohim, other than God. And so that's huge, because no other creation account has that as its beginning. And that's why I even said, it was in the last service. I didn't say it in the other two, but in like the Enuma Elish,
Yeah.
The opening line stated, when on high the heaven was not named, and below the earth no name was assigned. So something existed before even Apsu and Tiamat came into existence. What's even fascinating is when Apsu and Tiamat came into existence, they weren't the most powerful god.
No, we're not.
Marduk, who came later, was the most powerful god. So Elohim existed before anything existed, and that would have been revolutionary at this time, and it's even revolutionary now because even evolution. So where did the energy where did the energy come from that brought something into existence? Because that's again that's where, because you're saying something existed before existence came about, and like so even those who hold to evolution cannot answer where did the energy come from that brought something into existence, and where the Bible is saying that Elohim is the being that existed before anything came into existence. So that was reason number one.
Yeah, what would that have done for Israel at that time and then for us today? So Moses is now declaring that this is our origin. Elohim, the one who created, the one who existed, has brought us that far. How will they be looking at that story there in the wilderness and afterwards? How would that bring the transformation in their lives and say, oh, this answers the questions we had there? And what is that for us today when we know our story, that he existed, he is the beginning in time and space. And when now we know that story, what would they have done for Israel? And what did we see and for us today?
Well, it would have done for Israel what I wanted the big takeaway to do for us is that whatever you are in will determine your ending.
Yes.
And so it was a huge reveal for Israel that if you're in Elohim, who was before the beginning and got the beginning started, then he's with you, and he's going to be with you, over you, and he's going to take you to your ending. You know, so follow him, be embedded in him, be under him, be with him, because if you are, again, if he was before anything was, and you're in him and he's the one writing the story, you're going to ride basically his pen or his coattails to the very end. And so that's what I wanted, is that if you will find yourself in him, who was there before the beginning, and not only was he there before the beginning, but he's the one who got the beginning started. He's the one who's over not only the beginning, not only the middle, but also the end. And so make sure that your end is in him, so that you ride with him where he's going. And that's what I want to, because if he's the one writing the story, and he got it started, and he's the one over the middle and the end, just make sure that he's the one that you are looking to for guidance, for leadership, for your authority. Like it's that important to have a when I say an in, because you know who you are, whose you are, where you were, or where he was, where you are, and where you're going.
Yes. And so that's our first big takeaway, that your in story determines your end story. And I think that's where I can say, as I was processing this myself, how do I get in? And that is the gospel invitation. We're invited into the story that gives the end. One of the other teachings you've done here, and you can even comment on that before we go to the second one, is that you talk about, if you get it in Genesis, you follow the story of Israel, and then the church today, we are the Israel. Then we know the end, because you always take us right there to Revelation. So what should we be doing as we're thinking about that end? We know the end. We're in. What should be practical with? What are some principles that we can abide in as we know that we're in and we're going to go to the end? What are some of those principles or lifestyle or application that we can take?
Well, you mentioned something a moment ago about how do you get in,
Yeah.
and you get in through being redeemed. You got to
Yes.
be because something did go wrong. I mean, we'll get to that.
Agree.
And now, obviously, as a church, we talk about what went wrong all of the time, and we did a series entitled "Believe." And I actually thought that was and I didn't even plan it this way, but I thought it was a really good series that was a prelude to going back to Genesis, because to get in the story, you have to be redeemed by the God who's writing the story, because mankind rejected, rebelled, committed treason against the high king of heaven who created the heavens and the earth. And so to get in the story, you got to be redeemed. And how are you redeemed? You believe. You believe, you listen and obey. You heed, because that's what's going to happen. You are going to heed if you believe. So to be in this story, you got to believe that Jesus, because later on, Jesus is the cosmic king who came, who was born of a virgin. So it was the incarnate deity where God became man, fully God, fully human, so that he could take our punishment. He could take the wrath of God on himself. Well, okay, so if we believe in Jesus, then we are redeemed and we find ourselves in this story, because you need to be in this story,
Yes.
because human beings said basically we want to be our own story. We want to do life on our own. We'll take over. Well, that didn't go
Yeah.
very well. So, anyways, so to be in, you got to believe, right? So I think that really is the big takeaway here in terms of what is a principle to being in this kind of big story, is you do need to believe in God, and we know Him now, having revealed Himself as Jesus. That Jesus is the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament. He is Elohim. He is Yahweh. He is El Shaddai. That's God Almighty. He is Jehovah Sikkenu, the Lord our righteous. He is Jehovah Jireh, the Lord that provides. He is Jehovah Shema. He is the God who is there. He is Jehovah Rapha, or Rafi. He's the God who heals. Like Jesus is the God of the Old Testament revealed. And so to be in this story, you need to believe in Jesus. And so which then goes back to this second reason, is that you'll choose the one who brought everything into existence. And so the Gospel of John 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And so what we're seeing with John is he's revealing that Jesus is Elohim, because what we see in Genesis 1 is that, and God said, and God said, and God said, is that there's this logos that is speaking the world into existence. And so what John is going to do is actually connect the dots, that Elohim in the beginning is Jesus coming to the world, is the Word made flesh. And so Jesus is, so what John is saying is Jesus is the highest. He's the greatest. He's the largest. He's the biggest. He's the grandest. He's the loftiest. He's the preeminent one. And so if you're going to, if you're going to be in this story, you got to be in Jesus, because he is the God who brought it into existence. So that's really, really important as well. And when you're connecting these dots.
Yes, I love that, because the aim of the story. Now, you went on to talk about a second takeaway, that your in story should take guesses out of life and put confidence into life. Now, there you really dwelled on that. At 11 o'clock, you really dwelled on that it will take guesses out of life. And you went on to narrate many other things that we make guesses about. We guess about what is a human being, what is marriage, what is a parent. Why are those guesses, when we know we're in, why are those guesses there? Why are we having questions about that whole list that you were reading? What's wrong? Why does life seems to be broken? Why do we have those guesses if we're in? And how can we take those guesses out of it?
Yeah. Well, and I'll just connect these dots. So those takeaways were meant to be these kind of more reflective points from those reasons.
Yes.
So you'll choose the one who existed before anything existed.
Yes.
And so the big takeaway is your end story determines your end story. So being him, the second reason was you'll choose the one who brought everything into existence. Well, okay,
Yes.
so your end story should take guesses out of life and put confidence into your life. Well, if Jesus brought everything into existence, and he again everything into existence, heavens and the earth and everything therein. I mean, that's what Paul's going to say.
Yeah.
And he is the preeminent one, and he's the one who created human beings in his image. And he's also the one who gave us our functions of life, how we relate, create, and operate. Well, then, if we're in him, and he's the one who created everything, including us and what we're supposed to be doing, then now we have confidence in who we are,
yes,
whose we are, and what we're supposed to be doing and how we're supposed to be doing it. There's no more guesses because he's told us everything. He's given us all of the teleological goals of life, of again, our identity, who we belong to, our purpose, how we fulfill our purpose. So he takes the guesses out of life. And that's why, in that at the 11 o'clock, I got ticked off. I mean, I really did. Like I felt my blood pressure rising because I had said this quote 3 different times. And something just came over me where I just became indignant. I would hopefully righteously indignant.
Righteous indignant.
Because here are these men over the last century and a half that we as a civilization we put on a pedestal for their intellect.
Yes.
But when you look at what Neil Postman wrote, you take the collective intelligence of all of these men, and it has led to nothing but mass confusion.
Yes.
But mass hurt, mass heartache, that we have a generation now based upon the foundation that these men laid from their so-called intellect, that we don't even know what a human being is, that we don't even know what a man is or a woman, that we want to say that there are people in culture that says, oh no, it's just a Western construct. That gender is a Western construct, that marriage, there are people out there saying that marriage is a Western construct, that we created it, that it didn't necessarily exist from the very beginning, that it was something that we created because of religion. And then we want to, and so from now, these social constructs that we want, again, it's rooted in relativism, rooted in religion is the opium of the people. That's what Karl Marx said. That religion is just there to dominate you, to keep you enslaved. You need to break free from religion. Okay, so you broke free, but you're not freer. You're not more confident in life. And so that's where this holy righteous indignation comes from, because as well as we are seeing a generation spiral out of control. We're seeing a generation spiral into depression and anxiety because they just don't know, and they cannot make sense out of life. Why do they feel this way? And so if if we can get back to the origin of living out, and that's the thing, of living out the story, not in an oppressive way, but in a life-giving freedom way. Because, and that's what I want us to see even next week when we look at who Elohim is. He is not a restrictive God. He is a generous God, a benevolent God, a good God. And so if we can get back to this origin story of living it out, oh my gosh, it's going to be food for the soul of this culture that is so confused at who they are. And again, they're going to probably think that many of them are going to think that we're oppressive and we're we're old, kind of old news. But no, if we can get back to the origin story, because it's beautiful, it's beautiful.
So that I'm going to use a quote you used in the service, which related to Elohim. You said, Elohim, Yahweh, Jesus is the one who has given us the instruction manual. Therefore, we don't have to guess about more meaningful things in life. So you talk about Elohim, and then you talk about the instruction manual. And it was a classic illustration of Lego pieces. That was the correct way to say it, right?
Lego. Yeah. Well, Lego pieces, Lego bricks. Yeah.
Yeah. But you have to read the instruction manual. So that really gave a very good picture of how do we get to this manual that Elohim, Yahweh, Jesus has given us. How do we get to read that? It tells our origin story. It tells our existence. How do we get to that? Talk a little bit about how do we get to that story.
Yeah, so I mean, just think about an instruction manual that the Lego creators give each and every box.
Yes.
There's a beginning and an end. And so there are a lot of pieces and a lot of steps along the way. Okay. Well, so when we're reading the Bible, because this is why you need to be a student of the Bible. This is why I take the Bible so seriously, because it's a story. It's not just 66 independent books written across time. No, it's 66 chapters of one overarching story. And you do need to know that the various seasons of this overarching story, because you cannot read Habakkuk the way we read Matthew. So it's just it was written, and so but Habakkuk is telling us something. Leviticus, I think, can get very confusing to people, but not if you're reading it within its context of the unfolding narrative of God. Okay, so I give you four big frameworks of how to read the Bible: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We're reading the creation part right now. We'll get to at Easter the fall part where Adam and Eve sinned, rebelled, and then God has to then go to work redeeming. And so what you're seeing is that you have different stages of God's redeeming humanity. And so he's going to start out with Israel, and he's going to use Israel as this conduit of redemption. And it's not that he sets Israel up for failure. It's that they're already set up for failure because God is using Israel and him giving the law and this land to show Israel that they need something even greater in terms of redemption. That's what Paul's going to say in Galatians 3, that the law, the 613 commandments of moral, civil, ceremonial laws were to reveal the sinfulness of Israel and thus reveal the sinfulness of all human beings. So you have the Old Testament that is pointing to this fact that we as human beings, because Israel, so think about Adam was I'm trying to think of the more of the he was the first when I say the first man. So
Yeah.
Adam and Eve kind of they're the representatives of humanity. Well, Israel also serves as kind of this other Adam-ish, where they're representatives of God's kingdom. But they failed to be representatives, just as Adam failed to be representative of God and his kingdom. Okay. But all of the Old Testament is showing you how Israel failed. And then the other half of the Old Testament is revealing from the prophets what God's going to do. So you have these stages of redemption, of redemptive history that's leading you to and pointing you to the coming of the cosmic king. Who's the better Adam? Who's the better Israel? Who's the fulfillment of the promise of Abraham that God made to Abraham? Fulfillment of the promises to David that God made to David. So the Old Testament is pointing to this climax, which is why I wanted to show the storyline. Like Jesus is the crescendo of God's redemptive history. And that's why the Gospels are so important. And so now the climax of God's redemptive history has happened. And now we are at the beginning stages of new creation. So in some sense, God has, when I say begun the restoration project. So we are in the first few days now. So if you go back to Genesis 1, and you see the days of creation and God unfolding creation. Well, in Jesus, God is unfolding new creation. So it hasn't fully happened yet, but it's the beginning stages of it, which is why we still experience sin, why we still experience disease, why we still experience pain and suffering, and eventually death, because we're in the beginning stages. So now we're on the beginning stages. So we're now in this transition between redemption and restoration. So we've been redeemed, but we're waiting for full restoration. And that happens when Jesus comes back a second time. So that's how you read the Bible. So all of the New Testament is seen. So the Gospels are that transition period of Jesus coming and through his death and resurrection, bringing and ushering in full on out redemption and having the beginning stages of new creation. The other part of the New Testament is us reading about this redemption and awaiting full restoration. So that's how you read the Bible
Yes.
in that context.
I think going through this Genesis, the beginning, is revealing a lot that the bigger picture comes together. So when we're in, we need to be people who will be following the instruction manual, be reading that what Yahweh, what Jesus, and thank you for giving that framework of how we read the Bible. But you had a third point, which also I think it would lead that the in story of the Bible might be hard to receive, but it does make sense to believe. I see what you just talked about. Yes, I read the Bible. It might make sense, hard to believe or receive, but it needs to believe. So again, our first series was on belief, our vision series. And now we're saying, if I know my origin story, I'm reading the Bible. The way you have just narrated here, I'm reading the Bible. It said, it's hard to believe. It's hard to receive. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about how does Genesis help us to be able to say it's hard to receive, but it does make sense to believe?
Well, it's the thing about even the New Testament and Jesus is that, yes, I can understand where it might be difficult, hard to receive, because there are a lot of technical questions you might have. But if you're looking at the overarching story, it actually does make sense to believe. And this is one of the points I'll make this coming weekend, is that there is a mystery to faith. There is a mystery to God. Like, we don't know everything, but we know everything we need to know to make sense out of life. And that's my big because I want to at least acknowledge the the difficulties that some people have in coming to faith, that it might be hard to receive. But if we can put it within the true context of the story, that it actually is the only story. It really is. And I'll stand by that statement. It is the only story that actually makes sense for every human being, regardless of where they live, regardless of their background, every human being to believe. It makes sense for every human being to believe. So,
Yeah. And so when you say it makes sense, I think that's where the church stands on, that this book is what we should believe and what we should stand on. But then we live in a world today, we have these little stories that are not in the big story. So I'm reading the Bible because this is what I need to receive and I need to believe, but I'm struggling. What are ways that one that has accepted our origin story, that I'm now in the story, I'm reading the Bible, I am believing, but it is hard. So an example would be in some of the things you've mentioned, in parenting, in my job, in my marriage, in my community, in any arena, in all spheres of life, but I'm finding it hard. How do I, let me read my question here. How do I keep my focus of my little story in the bigger story, but I will continue to thrive and flourish?
yeah.
How do I stay in my bigger story to thrive and flourish with all what you have also, to use your word, you're facing all these headwinds that are coming against you? But I believe this book, believe this Bible.
Yeah.
What are some practical ways that you can exhort as a pastor, as a teacher, as a leader to say, hang in there. It's hard to receive, but it's good to believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if I have like details, because I do tell a lot of people just to hang in there. Uh, and what I mean by hang in there, just trust the Lord. I mean, if we can trust Him and believe in Him that He's the one who brought it all into existence, then He is working in some shape, form, or fashion for our good and His glory, even through the ups and downs of life. And so that's what I really encourage people, about in terms of the difficulties, and whether it's, sometimes it's just hard to receive the season that we're in, but again, if he can create out of nothing something, and he can bring everything to a conclusion that it's very good, which we'll look at in the next several weeks, then he can bring my life to the conclusion of very good. Now, again, that very good is the new creation, but that it can be very good even in the midst of pain and suffering right now. It might not be pleasant, but it's purposeful, and I can trust him. I can truly have confidence that even though I can't explain everything, even though I don't know all of the details, even though I don't know all of the specifics of why I'm going through what I'm going through, I can trust him who's writing the big story. And also, if he's writing that big story, he's also writing my little story, and I can trust in him. So,
well, that's been a good beginning, this series, in the series in Genesis that we've looked at. Our in story determines our end, and my story will be in the larger story. What are we looking forward to this weekend coming? As you talked a little bit of Elohim, you kind of tease that out there. What should we be looking for?
I'm just going to look. We're just going to look at all of the characteristics and descriptions of who Elohim is, from just Genesis 1. So we're going to look at all of basically the characteristics, almost a sketch of the kind of deity, the kind of God Elohim is, by what we read in Genesis 1. And then we will look at, okay, why does that matter? And what should that lead to when it comes to human beings, and how we would respond to who Elohim is? So that's what we're going to look at, and I can't wait. So,
well, Pastor Josh, thank you for starting us in Genesis. Now we know in the beginning, and now you're going to be telling us about God in the weeks coming, next week coming, Elohim. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Pastor Gus, for your life, your love, your encouragement, your leadership, and being a good co-host for Extra Takes. So,
I
well,
hope to be
Northland,
with you next week.
well, Northland family and friends, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Extra Takes. Until next week, blessings.
Thanks for listening to Extra Takes. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you won't miss a single episode.